Well, hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me for today's video. This is video number 3 in a 3-part series about the Atlantic world. And what I'll be finishing the short series with today is just talking a little bit about the Spanish Empire. We really won't talk much about Spain anymore after this stretch of time. And so I think it's good to take a minute to talk about Spain now. And also, as it relates to the Atlantic world, they were definitely early leaders in just the development of especially Central and South America. And as far as the success that countries had, they definitely had their success early. Now we'll talk a little bit in the video today about what took away from that success, but especially early stages, Atlantic world, Spain was having a good run. So just to briefly address a few issues with Spain. First of all, a person worth noting for this stretch of time for Spain was a guy by the name of Philip II. Spain became his to rule in the mid-1500s. And in addition to simply the country of Spain, he inherited the Spanish Netherlands, the colonies that Spain had at that point in time. And eventually, he would end up being leader, technically, for Portugal for a time. So this was a person that had a lot at his disposal, and especially when you consider the progress Spain was making during the 1500s, he definitely was able to take advantage, at least for a time, the really good period that Spain was experiencing. Now, one of the things that we can look to as I guess noting his success is that with this concept of mercantilism in place, as it was for these countries at this time, power was based on wealth, and Spain in the mid to late 1500s definitely had a lot of power. Even though we usually talk about countries like Spain, or whether it was England or France or Portugal or whoever, not finding as much gold or as much silver as they wanted, almost implying like they really didn't find anything, so they had to find something else to do. One thing that is actually quite true is they did find gold and they did find silver. And when you look at the screen up here and see that Spain, at least by the end of the time that Philip II was its leader, had amassed somewhere in the neighborhood of 170 tons of gold and somewhere in the neighborhood of 16,000 tons of silver. It's hard to imagine why it would ever be talked about like they didn't really find what they were looking for with gold and silver. It's like, how much gold and silver were they anticipating finding? How much gold and silver would have satisfied them? And when you think back to people like Cortez and the impression that the Aztecs had with the Spanish, I think the answer is there was no amount that was going to be enough. At any rate, when you adjust for the value of gold and silver today, and just to get a sense of what the value was for that, they found gold and silver valued at nearly $10 billion for each. So between the two, close to $20 billion worth of gold and silver. Obviously, when you throw around numbers like we often do today, where we talk about billions pretty easily and also talk about trillions, it might not sound like a lot, but that's a lot. That's a lot. Now, as far as what Spain was able to do with that, one of the things Philip II chose to do was put a lot of that resource, a lot of that wealth into building a military. One of the things that was not particularly common at this point in time was to have a large standing army, or really much of a standing army of any size. It took a lot of resources, and places and leaders just simply didn't put resources into that. So one of the things that Spain had that was a little different and somewhat unique at this point was a very significant army. And one of the things that sometimes will happen is if you have a significant army or a significant military, you may try to utilize that to achieve whatever your goals may be. And one of the things we see with Philip, and you can probably argue that this was a part of maybe the strength of Spain for a while, but also maybe contributed to its downfall, was he used that military and he used a lot of that wealth to try to defend Spain for Catholicism. Spain was a predominantly Catholic place, and under Philip's leadership especially, they took active steps to try to keep it that way. And so one of the things that led to were wars and fights against both Protestants, Protestant Christians, as well as Muslims. Now, there were examples of successes. Under Philip II's leadership. There was an attempt or a time where it looked like Muslims were pushing into Spain. They were able to successfully repel that effort. But then there were also times that you could look and say, well, was that really worth it? And in particular, there was a time where Spain went after England because of its Protestant nature, and in an event that's called the Spanish Armada, where the Spanish Armada, the Spanish fleet of ships, will end up being badly beaten. It ends up being a situation that, in some respects, is almost a bit comedic, where there's really a combination of some of the efforts made by the English, as well as just bad luck, bad weather. When it was all said and done, Spain ended up limping home after a pretty bad defeat at the hands of England. And one of the things that will be significant with that is when you look at the trajectory of the two countries moving forward, Spain and England, really the defeat of the Spanish Armada marks really the beginning of Spain's decline, and you just don't hear that much from them anymore. And then when you look at England, the victory over the Spanish Armada ends up being really a stepping stone towards a lot of growth and progress for England moving forward. So mixed bag as far as what Philip II chose to use those resources for. Something else that would also be a negative for Spain was experiencing significant inflation. Sometimes when you have access to good things, it doesn't always work out great for you. The adjustments often need to happen, and if those adjustments aren't made, you're in trouble. And so one of the negatives and one of the downsides, I guess, for Spain at actually acquiring so much gold and silver as quickly as they did, and then being able to have the resources they needed to make survival better, is they experienced some things that can definitely lead to inflation. For starters, they had a very significantly growing population, and usually that's viewed as a positive indicator. You can't have a growing population without plenty to eat and some good things going on. But one thing that does tend to come with a growing population is greater demand for the different goods and services that are available, which can lead to higher prices. That's one of the ways inflation can come. Now, another problem that Spain ended up having that contributed to severe inflation was that because they ended up with such an abundance of gold and silver, it didn't carry quite the same value that it had when it wasn't as readily available. That's one of the things about scarcity and what it does to what something is worth. Generally speaking, the more scarce something is, the more value it holds. The more abundant it is, the less value it holds. That's why it doesn't cost but just a couple, $2 or $3 to go get a 40-pound bag of dirt at the hardware store. Dirt's everywhere, so it's pretty cheap. But it would cost much more to get a, say, 20 or a 40-pound bag of diamonds. Those are not nearly as available. And then another thing that contributed to some problems for Spain was when the value of gold and silver went down, no adjustments were made to how they managed things such as tax collection. That even though, for example, we'll say $1 wasn't worth what $1 was before, if $1 is what they used to ask for in taxes, they continued collecting $1. And so you put all those things together, and not only did Spain spend a lot of money fighting wars that you could look back on and argue they maybe shouldn't have done that, but they also ended up having inflation problems. And by the end of the 1500s, early 1600s, Spain really had kind of had their run. And as far as being an influence in the Atlantic world, they would be relatively minor compared to some of the new things that were getting ready to come online. Topics and people and places that we'll get into more in my next video series. So thanks for watching. Appreciate you taking the time to watch these videos. And if you're hearing this, you have, in fact, watched the video. So thank you very much. We'll wrap things up here. Hope you join me for the next video series. Thanks.